I am a massive geek. I am a massively huge geek. And I can tell you things about Star Wars and Star Trek you probably never ever cared to know about those things, because I know kind of the stories and the things that are going on. In fact, I'm giving a talk for some of my students right now called "We Are All Baby Yoda," and my 6-year-old son saw my notes about this, and he's like, "That's something you're doing for work?" I'm like, "Yep, that's actually my talk." Well, think about it, right? So we don't know. I don't like. I walk into a classroom, or I come onto a Google Meet like I am with you guys right now, and I mean, I can see your names, and I can probably glean a little bit from the background of whatever room you happen to be in. Although some of you have the camera pointed deliberately up, not naming any names, Adam, so that we can't see the mess on the floor. That would be kind of on the lower part below where your camera is. But I don't know a whole lot about you other than your names. And maybe I know that you guys are from somewhere in or around Sherwood Park because you're hanging out at this youth group. But I don't know much else about you. And when you think about Baby Yoda, we don't know a whole lot about him either. I mean, we know he's 50. We know he's the same species as Master Yoda. We know he likes to eat a lot of random things that are just in front of him, whether he should eat them or not, which might apply to some of you as well. We don't know what he's going to become. I mean, one of the great questions I have here is, all right, so if Baby Yoda is a Jedi, which is, I think, what a lot of us are sort of the conclusion that a lot of us are kind of coming to, well, he's a Jedi that shows up before episode 7 happens. So is Kylo Ren going to kill Baby Yoda before episode 7? Right? Right? Like, and I'm not spoiling anything here because we don't know that. Like, we don't know what's going to happen, but we don't know what Baby Yoda's future is going to be. We don't know. Is he gonna like start training as a Jedi and say, to heck with this, I just want to hang out with my buddy Mando, and we'll just, I'll just kind of ride shotgun with him, and we'll do the thing for like 10 more seasons. Who knows? But this is the reality with you guys. I don't know where you're coming from. I also don't know what God's calling you to be. And lastly, what I'd say about Baby Yoda is he's kind of cute and kind of helpless. And I mean, people would say that about you as well, that some of you are kind of cute and kind of helpless. Anyway, moving on. That's not what Trisha asked me to talk about. She asked me to talk about the family. So on this big geek thing, 21 years ago in 1999, I went to a movie that I laughed more at this movie than I probably laughed at any movie I've ever been to in theaters in my life. Like, still to this day, I sat in this theater and I laughed so much that the kids sitting in the row in front of me were all looking back at me like, what's wrong with that guy? Because I just kept on laughing. And that movie is this movie. It's called Toy Story 2. How many of you guys have ever seen Toy Story 2? Now, as the Star Wars geek who's around here, obviously there's a lot of Star Wars references in this movie. Zurg is Buzz's father. Like, no, I am your father. No, that's it, right? Like, in fact, that scene's actually acted out better than the Empire Strikes Back scene where Darth Vader tells, that's impossible, right? Like, it's terrible. It's like it's the most iconic scene from the whole like series of Star Wars movies. And like, you watch it, it's painful. No, that, like, it's just so bad. But I laughed so much at Toy Story 2. Like, just there were so many good moments. And I'm 19 years old. I was out with some good friends, and there was like a row of us who were all like 19, 20, 21. And literally the 8 and 9-year-old kids in front of us were embarrassed at how much I was laughing at this movie. So, that is what it is. Not all of us can be as cool as Paul Corrigan is, just sort of saying that one, tossing that one out there. But if you've never seen it, have you all seen Toy Story 2, just out of curiosity here? Toy Story 2 is set 2 years after the original Toy Story movie. And in this movie, Buzz and Woody have kind of buried the hatchet on the whole fight of like throwing them out of the van or out of the window and all the other stuff like that. And they're friends. And because Woody gets damaged during playtime, he gets left behind when Andy goes off to camp. And so he's just kind of waiting for Andy to come back. But then Andy's mom decides, because the kid's gone, we're going to go clean up the kid's room and have a yard sale and sell off his toys, which, for the record, I think if I did that while my kids were away, they would disown me. If I went through and just started pulling toys off their shelves, I mean, I do this sometimes, and I get in trouble for it. What happened to this? Daddy gave it to Goodwill. Yeah, that's impossible. Oh, sorry, wrong movie. But anyway, so Woody goes to go and rescue a toy. He gets abducted by Al from Al's Toy Barn, and he's going to get sold to a museum in Japan, because it turns out he is the main character. He's the toy that represents the main character from some 60s TV show called Woody's Roundup. And there's all these other toys, notably the Prospector and Jessie and Bullseye. Well, to make a long story short, by the time you get to the end of Toy Story 2, Buzz is there to come and rescue Woody, kind of like the reverse of the first movie. And when they come back to Andy's house, they bring back two new toys: a horse named Bullseye, who acts more like a dog, which actually begs a number of questions that I have about a lot of Disney movies. Why it is that Pluto can't talk, but Goofy can, when I think they're both dogs? Why is it that Slinky Dog can talk, but Bullseye can't? Because anyway, perhaps when you think about the logic of these, it's just too much to ask from a Disney movie. Anyway, they get back. They've got Bullseye, the dog horse, and then Jessie, this kind of yodeling cowgirl. And Jessie says something really, really profound at the end of the movie after Andy writes his name on her foot. Because this is what Andy does with all his toys. He's got like a white Sharpie mark and he writes his name on the bottom of his toy's feet. Jessie looks at Bullseye and says, "Bullseye, we're part of a family again." Because they've spent conceivably years, potentially decades in storage waiting for Woody to come along so they could kind of go into this museum. And I remember that feeling. I vividly remember that feeling. So I mentioned to you before that I have one older brother who's 7 years older than I am. So I grew up in a family where, I remember being really young and thinking, this is great. I mean, not that my family was perfect. My parents fought sometimes. My brother hogtied me with a Nintendo controller one time and left me in the living room for like an hour, and there were different things that kind of went on. But overall, I think I had it pretty good when I was little. At least that's what I thought. My dad was in scouts with me and used to take me camping on a fairly regular basis. He also, through work, used to get Oilers tickets when we won games sometimes, and the Stanley Cup and stuff like that. Like there are pictures of me at Stanley Cup playoff games in the mid late 80s, like Stanley Cup finals games. By the time I was 10 years old, I'd seen the Oilers win 5 Stanley Cups. My son, who's 12, has seen them win 1 playoff series. Like it was a very different reality growing up being an Oilers fan when I was a kid. And I mean, I loved that. A lot of great memories with my dad. My brother was my hero. My mom stayed home, and I remember coming home to fresh bread. Like, and I don't mean like bread maker fresh bread, but I mean like bread that's been like beaten down and like and baked. And she'd set it so it would come out of the oven right as we were coming through the door after school. And if you guys have ever seen like fresh bread like that, where you slice it, you can literally see the steam coming. I hope not all of you had supper, because if you're hungry right now, this is like the most torturous thing that I could do to you. So just for that matter, if you're feeling really hungry right now, just imagine the smell of bacon and you'll be fine. Okay. It's all good. So there was a lot to love about my family, but right around the time I got into grade 4, it was almost like that whole sense of being loved, being safe, being secure in my family, it was ripped away from me. And there's a lot to that story that could be kind of its own talk. But to make a long story short, my family split up. And it was the first out of 3 times that my family split up, because my parents tried a couple of times to get back together, and it just didn't work out. The last one, which happened right before my grade 12 year. But I remember going from, kind of that sense of being so welcome, so safe, and so secure in my family, to feeling like I had nothing. And that, I would say, would be the thing I would describe most of my life in junior high. Now, I know it's hard to imagine when you think about how cool I am now, but I was this super awkward teenager. Like I was like, I know all of you guys, like all of you, I can tell, have it all together. You're all, you all feel totally confident every time you look at yourselves in the mirror, you talk to somebody else. But I really didn't. I really didn't. Like there was very little about me, you'd say, when I was 13 that was like, yeah, he's got it. Like, nah, it was all kinds of awkward. And so when my family stopped being a family, I went looking for other places to find family. And I remember trying out in junior high for the school basketball team. Now, I am not an elite athlete. Okay. Like no one will ever mistake me for being an elite athlete. I love playing sports, but I'm not good at any of them. And I remember partway through the first tryout, the coach who was my phys ed teacher said, "Hey, Mike, so you're not much of a basketball player, are you?" I didn't make the team. I tried to join up in grade 9 with the school band program. Now, everybody else had been in the band program for 2.5 years by this point in time, and I'm trying to come in 2.5 years into it, never having played a brass instrument in my life. And they handed me a French horn and said, "Hey, learn how to play this." And if any of you have played in a concert band, French horn is not the instrument anybody starts on. And though I have a deep love for music, I am completely incapable of reading sheet music. So we would go to festivals and I would kind of be able to kind of learn enough and memorize enough of the songs to kind of make my way through whatever songs we had to play. But then at festival, you have a sight reading, in a sense, clinic where you got to show a band teacher how good your band is at reading like a piece of music that you've seen just now for the first time. My band teacher said to me once, he said, just don't play. When we get the sight reading sheet music, just pretend to play, but don't make actually notes, because missing the notes you're supposed to be playing will be better than hearing the notes that you're not supposed to be playing. And so like it's like sports. All right, sports isn't going to be my thing. Music isn't going to be my thing. I mean, I was never alone when I went through school after my brother left, but I never had a huge group of friends. I mean, and Justin, this is by no means meant to be a comment coming back at you, but most people knew me as Michael Landry in my school. And it was not a term of affection at the time. Now, totally not a big deal today. Justin, don't worry about it, okay? But that was just kind of where it was with me. And I remember vividly, being part of a family again, because one of the things that happened was my church hired a youth minister. And I was only still going to church because we needed community service hours and I could altar serve at church. And it made my parents happy because even though they weren't going to church, I was still going to church. And so I would go and I would altar serve, and it would kind of, kill a number of birds with one stone. But I remember vividly the Sunday they introduced my youth minister, Tracy. And I remember sitting there thinking, I'm going to sign up for the youth group because they have to take me because it's the church. They can't cut me like the basketball team. They can't tell me not to play. It's the church. They have to. And then I went to my first youth group meeting, and I was 100% sold on being involved in this youth group because there was, I think it was 18 of us. 2 of us were guys. And so 15-year-old me is like, all right, there's got to be a girlfriend. Yeah, they all said no. See, awkward Mike, kind of looking back. But when I kind of got over these kind of ulterior motives for being in the youth group, they have to take me. I'll find a girlfriend here. I found family there. I found family in that group. The best man at my wedding was the other guy from the youth group that I went to in high school. Some of you who might have seen me singing at the Family Life Conference over the years or at different events over the years, one of the girls who sang with me for a long, long time was one of the girls from that youth group. It's just kind of funny how life has worked out like that. How somebody, a couple of still my dearest friends to this day. Even, and this is kind of funny, my wife's roommate when we started dating was a girl from my youth group. That was totally coincidental. Like, this is not like I didn't meet her through this girl. My wife just happened to be living with a girl I went to. Anyway, just kind of one of those funny things that happened. And I think the desire to be part of a family is something that God has kind of stamped into us. Because the way that God brought me back into the church was to bring me back into a family. And it's not that my family has bad people. My mom and my dad and my brother, they're not bad people. When my family broke up, they just had nothing left to give me. And I was lucky enough that God put other people in my life who filled in some of that gap for me. And some people, literally, one of the groomsmen at my wedding was the dad of my friend's girlfriend, my best friend's girlfriend's dad. Like, weird relationship, right? My best friend's girlfriend's dad, who still to this day prays with me in the same breath as his own kids. I was a lot more nervous to bring Jen home to meet him than I was to bring her home to meet my own parents, because he stepped into that role. And what's been fascinating to me is over the last 23 years that I've done this job of talking about this, I've learned that I'm not unique in that situation. That God sends people into our lives when God is a family. Like, think about this for a second. When you guys began in prayer tonight, you began in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. God is a family. Jesus chose to be born into a family. When we talk about what it means to make a covenant is God wanting to bring us into his family. I mean, you talk about baptism, we often talk about the forgiveness of sins and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. But one of the lesser discussed or lesser remembered effects of baptism is that we are adopted into the family of God, because by nature, we are creatures. We are things he made. but he doesn't want to leave us there. He wants us to be his sons and his daughters. And not only does he want that, he wants us to experience what it is to be a son and a daughter by showing us love, either ideally through our own parents, but when, like is the case in my family, when they can't do it, by sending others to fill in that gap for us. Because, I mean, St. John Paul II put it this way. He said, the future of humanity passes by way of the family. I mean, literally, that's how, family is often where kids come from. I mean, I won't explain this to you. We didn't send letters home, and it's not really the topic for this particular youth group. But even beyond the biological reality that this is where kids come from, where life comes from. How we shape our kids impacts what we love today. The fact that I play guitar today, the fact that I love the Oilers today are absolutely because my dad did it. Some of the lesser things that I do that I'm not as proud of are also things that I maybe have inherited a little bit from my family. But the future of humanity passes by way of the family. But here's the really great part about this. It's in the family that we learn what God's love looks like. I started off referencing The Mandalorian. It's really interesting. I've like this "We Are All Baby Yoda" talk that I'm giving to my students right now. When I was researching this, there's a whole series of Catholic essays online that compare The Mandalorian to Mando to Saint Joseph. Because Mando and Saint Joseph both choose essentially become foster dads to kids they have no real biological relationship with. Kids who have some sort of ability or destiny that they can't really imagine. And the decision to be in this relationship with this kid is going to require an incredible amount of sacrifice from them. They have to leave their career, their livelihood behind to go into exile. There's a pretty good argument to be made there about Joseph and the Mandalorian being very similar. But I'd take it a step further because I think whether you're looking at the Mandalorian or those of you guys who've never seen it are like, who is this guy and why is he talking about all the Star Wars? It's Trisha knows I'm a Star Wars geek. You got what you signed up for. So kind of is what it is. But I'd go a step further and I'd say when you look at a father figure, I mean, Joseph obviously being the ideal one, but you look at a father figure like the Mandalorian, or if you want to look at how Tony Stark treated Peter Parker in the Avengers movies, or if you're a Fresh Prince fan, how Uncle Phil brought in Will into his family and treated him as his own kid, better than his own dad could. Well, what you're getting here is a taste of what it is when we pray, Our Father. And it's not that I, as a dad, somehow determine what God is like. It's that the best qualities that I have as a dad are reflections of the perfect father that we all have in heaven. I could kind of go on and on and on about this. It's kind of something I spend a lot of time on. It's kind of something I spend a whole lot on. But I want to make something really clear to you guys, kind of to bring this to a close. And that's the fact that no matter what your eventual vocation is going to be, you are called to be a part of a family. Okay. In some cases, literally, like myself and Trisha, obviously not with each other, with our own respective spouses, we have been called to make a family, our own respective families with our own respective spouses. Just so that's really clear right now, lest I scandalize anybody here. But when you get married, you make a covenant, you make someone else family. And the love from that family goes out most often in the lives of your own kids. But in the cases of some people who sometimes can't have kids, I'll tell you, some of the most generous people I've known are some of the couples that I know who've never been able to have their own kids because all the love that they would have given to their own kids. I mean, we have a particular couple, the ones who would get my kids if something happened to Jen and I. Um, they have done extraordinarily generous things for my kids, and my kids are tremendously blessed because of it. And I know my kids aren't the only ones who are tremendously blessed because of it. So you might be called to literally start your own family. That might be something that you're called to do someday. Somebody might be called to be single. And the reality is that you then, kind of like these people who can't have their own kids, you get to bless a number of people. You're not kind of tied into one particular family, one particular circumstance. there is a calling. I mean, the reality is all of you are single right now. Even if you're dating, you're not like married to them. So technically your vocation is still single, just so we're clear on that. But you're called to love God with your whole heart. And you're also called to be the hands and the feet of Jesus in whatever you do. If you're called to religious life, well, that one's actually really easy because your religious community, that's a family. And it's kind of funny. I mean, I don't know if you guys obviously aren't big football fans because the Super Bowl's on right now and you're all at a youth group meeting. But one of the things I really enjoy on Super Bowl Sundays are the convent tweets about the Super Bowl. Because often they'll sit down and they'll watch the Super Bowl. Like these nuns will sit down and watch the Super Bowl together. The Pauline sisters, some of you guys know Sister Helena Burns, who has been around a couple of times in different schools and different churches, the Family Life Conference. You know, they often will tweet about the fact that there's some young nuns who are like, "Oh, it's so and so's performing at the Super Bowl this year," and then they've got like some 91-year-old nun in the comment, like, "Who? What is this?" And they just the laughter that kind of comes from the way that they perceive it. But it's totally a family. I was watching the Pauline sisters have a TikTok channel, you know, and they play pranks on each other and they show the videos of them playing pranks on each other on TikTok. So like one nun hid in a cupboard and then another nun sent a third nun over to go and grab a mug from the cupboard. And then, like the first one jumps out of the cupboard and the second one, like stuff is flying everywhere. Like they have like, it's a family. It's absolutely a family. And they fight. I mean, read Saint Teresa's autobiography, Story of a Soul, to learn how much they can fight like siblings do sometimes, get annoyed with each other. Like, I mean, I know none of you guys get annoyed with your siblings. You guys always get along perfectly, you know, just like Justin and his twin brother Keegan always did. And the Bacole kids, clearly. Anybody who's a Bacole, you know, you guys never fight. It's not in your nature. But but the reality is they fight, they argue, but it's a family. If you're called to be a priest, and there's a few of you who that's a possibility for here, I'll tell you, I have never been more struck by the sense of family that comes in the priesthood than I have when I've been to priests' funerals. Because if you've never been to a priest's funeral, the priest's funeral always ends with all the priests who are there gathered around the casket of their brother who's passed away. And there's a prayer that all priests pray. It's called the Liturgy of the Hours, but the last hour of the day is called night prayer. Night prayer always ends with a particular devotion to Mary. Um, Quite often, it's a sung prayer of the Hail Holy Queen, but sung in Latin. And I'll tell you, you've never experienced the brotherhood of the priesthood till you've sat in a cathedral listening to 20, 30, 50, 60 priests singing the Salve Regina a cappella, no microphones, and that sound resonating in the cathedral church. It is unbelievable. And I'll tell you, that was a moment where I'm like, I should be a priest. There's family right there. If you come from an amazingly solid family, you're going to bring those experiences and that tremendous giftedness into your vocation as a priest, religious sister, brother, single person, whatever it might be. If you're like me and you come from a broken family, you bring something extraordinary because I think one of the things that I brought into my marriage is the fact that I don't take marriage for granted. I realize the fact that you got to work at it, you got to work for it, that it doesn't always go the way you wanted it to. But there's a great gift in knowing that no matter what family you come from, no matter what family you might find yourself in, and the reality is you might find yourself in a family later on, or you know, things may not go again as we would want them to, or as we would hope they would. You are always part of a much bigger family of God. And kind of like I figured out when I was 15, they have to take you. They have no choice. God's already chosen you. So you're there. You're in the family. I mean, that's the thing, right? We pick our friends. We don't pick our siblings. Well, the reality is we don't get to pick our siblings in the family of God because God says you're in. I want you there. I love you. So all that being said, last encouragement is I would encourage you guys to pray for your vocations. Not just pray, God, tell me what my vocation is, but pray for the family that I'll be a part of when I'm in a vocation. And the reality is, I mean, if you're sitting there praying, you know, for your future spouse, whoever that might be, and you're actually called to something else, God's not going to like be like, well, that was a wasted prayer. Good luck with that. No, God will take the prayer that you're praying for, you know, this guy or girl that you think might be out there, and He'll apply it to your religious community or your parish or whatever it might be where you're going to serve. God's kind of pretty great that way, where He makes sure that none of our prayers are ever wasted. But pray for your future family. Pray that your heart will be ready to love them and to serve them and to walk with them when you get there. And pray that they would be ready to do the same. Again, spouse, whatever. I have friends. I have actually my youth minister. She talked about the fact that her mom used to sit her down and they used to pray for her future husband. They started doing this when she was 14, and at the same time as she's doing this when she's 14, they went back and they did the math. This is when her future husband was having his conversion experience, right when she and her mom started praying for him, and they wouldn't meet for another 11 years. Prayers are never wasted. Pray for your future vocation. Pray for the family that God will call you to be a part of. The family God will call you to serve and love and sacrifice for, like Mando does, like Joseph does. Eastern Catholic. I'll talk about Pope Francis. I will talk about Pope Francis.
Oh, that would be great. Cool. Go for it.
So, all right. So, your grandma is very Catholic, but doesn't like Pope Francis. What should I think of this? Okay. So, do you want to close the Jamboard so I can see the people again? Because all I can see is the Jamboard now, not the people. I feel like that scene in Madagascar, like, can you take me to the people? Oh, we have the people. And then the people are dead, and it's very, very bad. Interestingly enough, do you know what they call a group of lemurs? This is not a dad joke. A group of lemurs is called a conspiracy. So you think about that scene where like, oh, we have the people. And I'm like, it's totally a conspiracy of lemurs when they're hanging out in that airplane with the dead people. I'm like, this just gives like a whole other layer to that scene in that movie. Okay, anyway, random. Can't tell me I didn't teach you anything tonight. You learned that a group of lemurs is called a conspiracy. So there you go. Okay, Pope Francis. So in my lifetime, I've known 3 popes. Okay, so I was born about a year and a half after John Paul II became pope, and he was pope from 1978 till 2005. And Pope John Paul II, I mean, a lot of people will compare him to Batman, and with good reason, because like Batman, he lost his family when they were young, and like Batman, he trained in secret to fight against injustice, and like Batman, he came out with like this sweet cape on, and like this whole different sequence of things, and never killed anybody who hurt his family or anything like that. Like there's a great meme. Look up Batman John Paul II. There's a great meme about this, right? So you can kind of look at that, and John Paul II is extraordinarily cool. Okay. John Paul II has a background in theater. And so he had a way, particularly when he was younger, when he would step on stage, he would use that whole theater background to, in a sense, to play to the crowd. And there's scenes of him like 93 when he was in Denver for World Youth Day. He's got the cape on and the wind's blowing. Like it's just kind of this great scene. By the time I saw him in 2002 when he was in Toronto for World Youth Day, Parkinson's has ravaged his body, and he like it was the last time he walked in public. Last time he was able to kneel down and kiss the ground like he always did whenever he went a different place. But he was a man who just reeked of holiness, of sanctity. Like you knew he was a saint. But the thing that we forget sometimes is in the first 10, 12 years of his time as Pope, he made a concerted effort to take on communism. Because we were living in a time when I was growing up, when I was 5 or 6 years old, we were living through the Cold War, and it was a time where there was a very real fear that World War III was gonna happen between the United States and Soviet Union. And you know who sits right between the United States and the Soviet Union, the most direct path? That would be Canada. Like that would be bad. A nuclear war between the States and the Soviet Union would be bad because we would have been right in the middle of it. And so John Paul II, like he'd lived through the Soviet occupation, the communist occupation of Poland. He'd lived through all of this stuff. And when they elected him Pope, I don't know how much of this, because obviously I've never been in a conclave, but the fact that he was elected from under the nose of a communist country, I don't think was an accident. Even if it wasn't something the cardinals intended, it's something that the Holy Spirit certainly intended. Because one of the first things he did was he went home into a country where religious gatherings were illegal, and he celebrated mass for 1 million people in a field where the president of Poland, who was a communist, had to stand by and let it happen. And 13 years later, when the Soviet Union fell, and Mikhail Gorbachev was talking about kind of what brought down this empire, that mass in that field in 79 was kind of one of those key moments. And it was such a key moment that like a lot of people trace back the assassination attempt to the communists basically trying to get him out of there to get rid of John Paul II so that he wouldn't be able to keep doing this. So it's like, we're still in charge. He can flout us, but we're still bigger than this, and it doesn't matter. And so God called John Paul II at a very specific time for a very specific purpose. And so you've got his ability to take down the communists. You've got the way in which he really, like, he brought church to the masses. I mean, and literally traveled more than any other pope ever had, canonized more saints than any other pope ever had. You know, things like World Youth Day, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Like, there are things that are legacies left behind. And that's not even saying a word about the theology of the body or other things that he worked on over the years. Like, just a spiritual giant of a man. And when he died in 2005, like, the world stopped. Okay, so we're all still on flip phones back in 2005. Okay, you're not watching, you're not streaming anything on flip phones. You're not like you're barely text messaging with something called T9, which was just really awkward and terrible. And it was good that we stopped doing that, and we should never speak of it again. But he died in 2005, and like CBC and CNN, which are like the major news networks, they had a still shot of his bedroom window at the Vatican for like a week, because he came out on Easter Sunday and he gave the blessing to the city and to the world, and he couldn't speak. Like, they put a microphone in front of him, and he tried to speak, and he couldn't. And so he just gave his blessing, and then we never saw him alive in public again. And as the week wore on, kind of Easter week wore on, and it became clear that he was going to die, like, literally, people started flocking to Rome. The square filled with young people keeping vigil and saying, like, it was unbelievable to watch this. And so CBC is like canceling all their regular programming and running this 24/7 shot of his window with people talking about all these things that John Paul II did. And just think about this for a second, okay? When his funeral was celebrated, on behalf of the British Crown, Prince Charles, who was the Crown Prince of England, attended the funeral on behalf of the British Crown as the future head of the Church of England. Like, so many religious leaders, so many world leaders all went to his funeral, right? Prince Charles was supposed to get married that day. They rescheduled Prince Charles's wedding to Camilla because he went to John Paul II's funeral. The Crown Prince of England, who's going to be the future head of the Anglican Church, rescheduled his. Like, this is how big John Paul II was to the world. Not everybody loved John Paul II. If you were somebody who was a more left-leaning or more liberal kind of Catholic, John Paul II was, you know, he was very there. He was very present to stuff, but he was very strict. Like, this is what it is. One of the things about John Paul II is before he was Pope, he was a theology professor. Father Jan Sobkovich, who was one of the priests in Red Deer, actually took classes from him in Poland before he moved here. He was a university professor. Okay. So when you're a theology professor, and I have friends who are theology professors, you're very concerned about being very specific and very clear. So when John Paul II spoke, when he taught with a clarity, he taught with authority. And the people who didn't like him, it's not because he wasn't clear, it's because they didn't like what he was teaching. They wanted him to allow women priests or married priests, or loosen this or loosen that, or contraception, or, you know, you kind of name the controversial topics that are still the controversial topics today. And, you know, people didn't like his answers to those questions. Okay, so he dies. And I think it had to be Ratzinger who took his place, because Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, had been John Paul II's right-hand man for the better part of his entire time as Pope. He'd been the head of what's called the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which, if you know anything about church history, this is the congregation or the office of the Vatican that used to be called the Inquisition. If you go back to kind of the Reformation times and stuff like that, his job was to make sure that the things that were being taught by the church were accurate. And in a lot of ways, we're going to forget Benedict because John Paul II was such a spiritual giant. But I have one of my friends, Father Stefano Penna, thinks that Benedict could be a doctor of the church, in the sense that what he wrote and what he taught is so important. It's the kind of thing that has a universal application when you go into the stuff that he wrote and that he taught. Just an unbelievably brilliant mind. And again, a theology professor. Pope Francis is not a theology professor. He is the first pope to come from South America. And South America is a very, very different part of the church than Europe is, than North America is. And some of the things that have to be dealt with there, it's just such a different reality. But I think the biggest thing that you need to think about when you think about Pope Francis is he's not a theology professor, he's a pastor. He is a pastor first and foremost. And so you'll hear him talk about the messiness of doing ministry. He described the church as a field hospital. He talks about the fact that those who are pastors, those who are bishops, need to have the smell of the sheep. In other words, go and be where the sheep, where the people are. When I was at World Youth Day in Toronto in 2002, the cardinal from Belgium, they had the whole thing with the Pope, and the cardinal from Belgium, remember, walked off the stage after the prayer vigil with the Pope, and the Belgian pilgrims were camping right in front of where we were sleeping. And he came out and he rolled out his sleeping bag and he unbuttoned his cassock and a t-shirt and shorts on underneath it, and he laid down and he slept in the field with his pilgrims. Cardinal Collins, no disrespect to him, he stayed in a hotel. It's a different way of being a pastor or a bishop. Now, I love Cardinal Collins dearly, just so we're clear on this. He's somebody who's meant a lot to me very personally, somebody who's very, very good to me during his time when he was the bishop here. But I was wowed by the fact that a cardinal was sleeping under the stars with the rest of us and had to live through the rainstorm that came the next morning. Pope Francis is cut from that same sort of a cloth. And I think where a lot of people, who really loved Benedict and who really loved John Paul II, where they really struggle with Pope Francis, is the fact that because he's a pastor, he's worried about the sheep wherever they are. And so rather than being really measured in what he says and making sure that what he says is really specifically accurate, like a theology professor would do, because it's what they're trained to do, Pope Francis asks difficult questions sometimes, not because he's trying to change the church or he's trying to undermine the church or he's trying to undo the church. A really good example of this was a few years back. He asked the question, what can we do for Catholics who are divorced and remarried? Now, Trish and I have both shared about the fact that we come from families where our parents were divorced, right? What do you do when you've got people and a not insignificant number of people in your church around the world who are people who sometimes they got married at 19, never got an annulment, got remarried, and now they want to come back to the church? How do we take care of them? And they had a whole synod of bishops, a gathering of bishops to ask this question. You know what changed about the teaching of the church as a result of that synod? Nothing. Nothing changed. But it was a question of, how do we look out for these members of my flock that are lost? And I thought, if you guys remember in March, kind of at the height of fear in the pandemic, like right when we're at the worst, we don't know what's going to happen, we don't know how long this is going to go on. We're like, it was for me at least the scariest part of this, because you didn't know. He did that whole prayer service in St. Peter's Square. And to me, I hope that the lingering image from his papacy isn't the stuff that we have a hard time with because he said something off the cuff that wasn't as well thought out as a professor would. It was what he did that day when he's in St. Peter's Square and he's praying for the world. And he, in this square that normally, again, would be filled with tens of thousands of pilgrims on a day like that, he's there by himself, leading this prayer, giving his blessing to the world. Like I say, I think where most people struggle are, particularly for those who would fit more on the more conservative side, who really love John Paul II, who really love Benedict because they were so clear and so brilliant in their teaching. They miss that because it's not always what Francis says, it's what he doesn't say that leaves people wondering. But if you consider the part of the world that he comes from, people would look at him and say he's actually very conservative compared to a lot of the priests that work in the church in South America. And he's trying to bridge the gaps between where he's come from and where the rest of us are. He's trying to keep us together. So I get why people struggle with him. But I think part of it is we're expecting him to be, in a sense, the third iteration of what we saw with John Paul II, of what we had with Benedict. And he's not. But in the middle of a global pandemic, that's not what we need. We don't need a theologian right now. We need a pastor, especially right now. Like in this, wherever we are in this, we're 11 months in, and however much longer this is going to go. To me, that's the thing we need more than anything. So that's my response. And that's not an excuse, by the way. I'm not saying that that's an excuse for him to go off and kind of say whatever he wants and kind of make up theology, but I don't think that's what he does. I think that's the Holy Spirit. I think the Holy Spirit picked him potentially specifically for this moment in history. So and that's speculative. That's obviously that's opinion, but that's how I look at him. And when you read, the other thing is people take the stuff he says out of context all the flippin' time. read Francis's actual homilies, read Francis's actual interviews, read Francis's actual letters. And it's very, very different. There was the whole like, well, he's just changed this thing on blood. You're like, no, he didn't. It's not what he said. Like, and that like I say, the divorced and remarried for communion, that's a perfect example of it. What can we do for them is different than, well, let's just give the Eucharist to whoever, which is what people were fearing he was doing, which is not the motivation, not the goal, and not the end game.